On today's Food for Thought, I'm with Richard Deeboo, author of The Meat Delusion. Hi Richard, how are you today?
I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
I'm fantastic, I have to
Good,
say.
good. Excellent, glad to hear it.
Now Richard, give my audience a little bit of background about the work that you do, because it seems quite broad from what I can see, because I know you're a writer, but what else do you do?
Yes, that's right. I've got a couple of books that I've written. You mentioned The Meat Delusion, which is the latest book that I've released. I've also got another book which is called Who Speaks for Earthlings, which is a collection of short writing pieces and speeches and commentaries and some poetry as well that I've done over recent years. But you're right, it's not only writing that I do in terms of my animal rights advocacy. For the last 10 years or so, I've been quite keen on promoting animal rights and using whatever time I've got, whatever opportunities I have, to articulate and communicate what I regard as the importance of talking about animal rights as a key social justice issue for this century. It's something that I think we all need to address. So through that, I do a lot of public speaking at either national rallies and demonstrations or other public events talking about any aspects of animal rights issues. I'm also a school speaker in secondary schools on behalf of a number of campaigning groups and charities, where I'll go into schools and deliver presentations and talks on all aspects of animal rights and veganism. That can be in terms of the ethics around our use of other animals. It could be around the health implications of having a diet that is dominated by animal body parts and fluids, a meat and dairy diet, and talking about the benefits instead of a plant-based diet. Or it could also be talking around issues such as the impact of animal farming on the environment and global warming, and also other uses of animals such as biomedical research, or vivisection as we used to call it. So any aspects of the use of animals, the negative, the adverse use of other animals, and the impact that has on both those animals whose lives are damaged and very often destroyed by what we do to them, the impact on ourselves in terms of our physical and psychological health by what we do, and also the impact then on the environment and the entire global planetary system because of our use and overuse of animals. And however I can do that, through my writing, through my public speaking, through my educational talks in schools and youth groups and any other forum that I've got, then I'll take any and every opportunity I possibly can to talk about what I regard as such an important issue.
Now, you use the word social justice, and that's actually quite a strong word. Why do you consider it a social justice issue?
Yes, and I do that very deliberately and incorporate it into an overall view of how our society is structured and the policies that we have as a society and what that means for other species with whom we share this planet. So I do describe it as a social justice issue because I do think that whereas over the last 150 years we have as a society, both in the UK and also globally, advanced considerably from where we were in terms of looking at the emancipation, for example, of women and their role in society and stopping discrimination based upon gender issues, our advances in terms of people's sexual orientation and not being discriminatory based upon somebody's sexual preferences. Also in terms of how we used to treat young people. You know, a century ago, young persons did not get a full education from the age of 5 or 6. They were just made to go out and get jobs from an early age. And we simply do not do that anymore. So we've changed significantly there as well. And you think also in terms of other previously persecuted groups in our society, such as the disabled, those with mental and or physical disabilities. We have come somewhere. We've actually have advanced in terms of our overall social policy in how we treat people in our society. But I do think that the one most significantly marginalized group and the one that is now today the most persecuted, the most abused, is all of those other animal species with whom we share this planet. We still use other animals in so many ways, whether it's for food in terms of the animal farming industry, whether it's in terms of our alleged science and experimenting upon them, or in terms of sport or entertainment, such as things like the fox hunting or hare coursing that we have in various parts of the United Kingdom. There's various ways in which other animals' needs in society are not taken seriously, their welfare interests are not taken seriously. Their own interest in living their own lives is absolutely not taken into consideration. And it is still the case that ordinarily in society most people still do believe that other animals are simply there for our use. Whatever we want to do to them, apparently we can do it to them, and we do not have to care about what we do. And I regard, therefore, that as being such a significant, such a huge social justice issue, because those groups, those other animals, do not deserve that marginalization, that abuse, that destruction, the pain and the suffering that we inflict upon them. They, just like women or children or those with mental and or physical incapacities, who all deserve an equal role and rights in society, those other animals also deserve that too, and they're not getting it at the moment. And I do think that that is a key issue for us to address, because it is having such a major impact on all of those animals, of course, whose lives are destroyed, but also ourselves, because we do have a desire, certainly in the West, that is dominated by their bodies and their fluids, and that has a significant impact on our own physical and mental health, and also the environment as well, upon which we all rely for our actual second-by-second existence. We know now that animal farming is a major contributor to climate change and environmental destruction, whether on the land or the seas and the oceans, and we really need to start addressing this with considerable urgency.
Let me just pick up on some of the things that you've said there, because you've talked about the abuse, the pain and the suffering, but what is the reality now of our dairy and meat industry? Because most people would believe in this day and age that actually conditions are far better than they used to be.
They would, you're absolutely right, and that is something that the animal farming industry itself would be very keen to promote, and anybody who either watches those adverts on television or sees any of their advertisements on billboards or in newspapers will be led to believe that welfare interests of farmed animals are taken extremely seriously. And if you ask anybody who consumes animal body parts, whether that's their meat or their dairy products that are produced, most people will say that they only buy humanely reared and humanely killed meat products or dairy products, and they take animal welfare interests seriously. And everybody seems to suggest that, but it is still the case that over 90% of the animal product foods that are purchased in this country and other countries as well still comes from intensive factory farmed environments. And these environments are never going to be ones that is going to take first and foremost as its starting point the fundamental welfare interests of those farmed animals. Inevitably and necessarily, because of what it involves, it is always, of course, uniformly fatal for the animals concerned. So even if they do these days, compared to previous generations, have an extra little bit of space in which to move around or a little bit extra bedding in which to nestle down in the evening, they are still going to be killed. They are still going to be trucked along to the slaughterhouse, and slaughterhouses are still the same as they always were. They're still extraordinarily brutal, violent places, and those animals will suffer terribly there. But prior to that, they're still suffering on the farms as well. So, for example, if we think about the dairy industry, then, of course, the cows are, if we talk about cow's milk, then cows are only producing milk in the first place because they've been made to be pregnant, to produce offspring. And that's the mother cow, of course, only wants to give her milk to her offspring once he or she is born, but they don't have the opportunity to express their natural maternal behaviors. As soon as the calf is born, he or she is taken away because we want to get access to her milk instead. The calf, of course, has one of two equally deplorable outcomes, depending on whether they're male or female. If they're male, then the likelihood is they might be immediately shot dead within a day or two of birth, or if they're female, they will be in their own way taken away and locked into small cages where they'll be fed a substitute milk, not their mother's milk, and await their own turn of being forcibly impregnated to continually produce milk for our use instead. So even though the cows are not immediately killed in that environment, they still suffer terribly in terms of the life that they are forced to live. And for those animals who are bred purely and simply for their flesh, for example, pigs, for the pork sausages that too many people are so keen on having, they are, as we know, incredibly intelligent, sensitive, smart animals. And yet they pretty much all live in confined environments, never seeing outdoor air and experiencing outdoor environments, never feeling the wind on their face. They pretty much spend the entirety of their lives locked in dark, windowless sheds where they are forced to overeat to grow very, very quickly. And then when they're merely 6 months of age, that's when they're killed. So their lives are in no way a natural way for those animals to live. Similarly for other animals such as chickens as well. For those chickens that are described as broiler chickens, that is those who are bred purely for their flesh, they're genetically engineered in order to grow extremely quickly and to put on weight extremely quickly. So they're very often, whilst they're growing, their bodies can't cope with how much weight is being put on, so they end up being lame and disabled, their legs break, they're scrabbling around the sheds in which they're confined, they're struggling to survive, and they're dead at 40 days. They could, in the natural environment, live for 6 or 7 or longer years, and yet in the farming industry, they're dead within days, literally 6 or 7 weeks, and it's all over for them. And if we talk about those chickens who are bred for their eggs, then they suffer too. I mean, they're having an equally deplorable time on the farm. The vast, vast majority of them are also bred in intensive environments, even those that are described as organic environments or, supposedly high welfare environments. The vast majority of these chickens are living indoors for the vast majority of their lives with very little room for maneuver. They are deliberately bred foods that cause them to produce eggs at an astonishing and unnatural rate, 1 or more per day, when ordinarily, naturally, they'd probably produce no more than 1 or 2 per week. And so their systems just cannot cope with that. This is really an unnatural way for them to live. And their working life, if we describe it in those terms, is usually around about 18 months. They could, if they were left to their own devices and left to live a more natural life, could live for 7, 8 years or even longer, but they tend to only be productive for the egg industry for about 18 months. And after that time, their egg production drops dramatically, and so for the farmer, they're no longer of any economic value, and so they're sent off to the slaughterhouse. Even though they could live potentially for years longer, their lives are ended. And that journey to the slaughterhouse is violent, it's dangerous, it's stressful for them, and of course their killing process in the slaughterhouse is never a good thing. We do use the phrase being humanely killed, but if we're honest and if we look at things as they really are, we will know that there is no genuinely humane way to take the life of someone who is fearful, stressed, terrified, and who would rather, much, much rather live instead. So even though there's a lot of talk these days about high welfare standards on farms or taking more seriously the welfare interests of the animals who are farmed, the reality is very different. What always takes precedent is the human interest. What always takes precedent is the farmer's profit motive. And the welfare interest always going to come secondary to those considerations. And as I say, the inevitable result of animal farming anyway is that it is uniformly fatal for every animal born into that environment.
There's a huge amount of marketing spin done around this, isn't there? Because you've used several pieces of marketing there, language in regards to things like cruelty-free, the farm fresh, free range. Now, that would promote a thought that actually those animals are actually treated far, far better, but it's even shown by lots of the research that's done into these campaigns that actually that's not the case, is it? It really isn't the case.
You're absolutely right, and you make the very good point about the way that marketing materials are designed quite deliberately to lead people as consumers to think that animals raised in those environments that are being promoted, that it's all okay for them, that it's good for them. But terms like organic or free range, as we know, have no formal legal definition, and they are very nebulous terms, and pretty much any, farm enterprise of whatever kind can use those phrases and use those phrases in their marketing and promotional materials with no threat of any kind of comeback from anybody that they happen to be lying or making misrepresentations to the public about what they're saying. So, for example, in terms of free range, as a statement, for example, in terms of, eggs that are farm fresh and so on and so forth, you can have 10 or 20,000 chickens just in one very large shed, but so long as there is a small opening at one or other end of that shed, that those hens that are very closest to that little opening can get in and out, then that apparently is sufficient for a farm enterprise to be able to describe itself as free range. But for the vast, vast majority of the hens in that environment are not ranging free at all. They're confined in incredibly overcrowded conditions with their fellow hens in an environment that is dirty, it's dangerous, there's no room for them to maneuver or to express any of their natural behaviors. And yet, on the packaging, nobody would ever know that that's how they live their lives, that they are confined in that kind of a way. Consumers see the phrase free range and they are, you're absolutely right, they're led to believe that there is something positive about how those hens are treated, and it's just not true. And there's another example of that. It's something that I mention in my book, The Meat Delusion, was a campaign a few years ago that Jamie Oliver, the celebrity chef who has a very high public profile, as we know, and is very well regarded by the public, was promoting the production and consumption of pork products, because a number of pig producers have gone to him and were talking about how difficult it was to get consumers to buy their products. The amount of pork being sold and purchased in supermarkets had dropped a fair amount over recent years, and they really wanted some means as an industry to be able to promote that buying pork products was a good thing. And Jamie Oliver allowed himself to be, and wanted to be, the front face of a campaign that they talked about the British pork standard, a quality mark for the standard of British pork, that the animals raised in the farms that had this accreditation that Jamie Oliver was supporting were promoting very healthy pigs who lived natural, healthy lives, that they had really great conditions and had lots of fresh, clean drinking water available to these pigs every day whenever they wanted it, literally on tap. And some of their promotional materials used by the industry at this time showed pigs drinking sparklingly clean water from taps, gushing with wonderful clean water. It was all marvellous. And that the highest welfare standards were being used in these farm enterprises. But one of the campaigning groups in the UK, Animal Aid, at that time was doing an investigation into pork production or the use of pigs in animal farming, and they did some undercover reporting and investigations on a number of these farms, and what they found was radically different to how things were promoted in the marketing materials. When they went in there, they saw unbelievably dirty, filthy conditions, farming enterprises that were horrendously overcrowded. They saw disabled and injured pigs staggering around with broken limbs, or they were profoundly unwell and unhealthy, and they couldn't even stand anymore but were lying in corners, breathing their last. They found whole bags just full of empty syringes and medications that were being pumped into these pigs to keep them alive long enough until the pig farmer was ready to have them sent off for slaughter. They found bags as well of dead piglets all crammed together just in carrier bags. They just died on the farm, they died on the floor, and they'd all just been gathered up and dumped into a bag together and just left amongst all the living as well. These realities that were found on a number of farms up and down the country differed dramatically from the marketing materials and the kinds of things that somebody with a high profile like Jamie Oliver was claiming for that industry. So there is this massive disconnect between what really goes on in the animal farming industry and the way that it's presented. So I, as somebody who's trying to advocate and talk about animal rights and talking about changes to what we should be doing in terms of other animals, I absolutely do not blame people for what they think and what they feel and believe about animal farming in terms of what phrases such as free range and organic and farm fresh might actually mean, or their understanding of what farming enterprises are like today. They are bombarded relentlessly with so many super positive messages by the industry about how things are. And that's probably one of the reasons, therefore, why I advocate so strongly and I work so hard and so tirelessly to try and talk about how things really are, to give people a better understanding, a clarity around this issue, which is so dirtied by an industry that has so much to hide.
The thing is that it's purposefully disassociating us from the reality, isn't it? But I wonder, in my mind, I feel that people are complicit in that. They want to turn a blind eye to it because they want cheaper products. They want cheaper meat. They want to be able to feed their family. And therefore, people will turn a blind eye to ultimately what is happening in that industry. There'll be more of an outcry about Cecil the lion and the Chinese dogs that are in the festival that are going to be eaten than there would about the millions upon millions of animals that are slaughtered every year in ways that we really wouldn't want to actually consider.
Yes, you're right, and that's something that I talk about quite extensively in my book, The Meat Delusion, is that there is this delusion, and I say we are lied to, and it's absolutely right, we are lied to by the industry, but you make a very good point that we also lie to ourselves as well. I know that certainly when I do a fair amount of my advocacy, if I'm engaged in conversation with people about these things, on a number of occasions people will say they don't want to know, they prefer not to know. They kind of do know about what these things are, and they kind of at the back of their mind do have this understanding, they have this sense, this feeling that to take a living, breathing, sentient animal and then render them, to turn them into product on a supermarket shelf, that somehow is violent, there is somehow that is a bloody thing to do, and there is somehow that is difficult morally to understand or to accept. And we do lie to ourselves, and we do want to hide behind phrases such as organic and grass-fed and free range and these kinds of things. It is amazing the number of times that I talk to people who, when they say they do have meat products, they almost invariably these days say, oh, but I only have the organic, I only have the free range. And yet, as I say, the statistics are quite clear, the evidence is perfectly plain, that still over 90% of the meat and dairy products sold in this country, in the UK, still comes from those intensive environments. Somebody's buying this stuff, and yet nobody's being honest enough to say, yes, you're right, I'm one of those people who goes along to the supermarket and buys 50 sausages for £1, or buys a whole chicken, so-called, a whole corpse, if you like, for £2.50 of a chicken or something. And they're not acknowledging and admitting that because they want things at such a cheap price, that they're potentially, therefore, and in fact it is so likely, therefore, that there are going to be profound welfare consequences for the animals who are confined in that environment, let alone the fact that those animals are killed anyway. The conditions in which they're kept are so likely to be deplorable and horrendous for those animals because the farming enterprises have got to supply stuff to the supermarkets, and the supermarkets themselves want to sell stuff at such a cheap price that the one thing that is always going to give is the interest of the animals who are being farmed in the first place.
Well, it's all become a matter of economics, hasn't it, ultimately, and even the policies of the government support the economic side of that.
It does, you're absolutely right, and we see that recently with, a number of milk producers across the UK complaining about the prices involved. And yes, they may well complain about the prices that some supermarkets are paying them per quart of milk and so on, but there's a fundamental problem here, which is that it does not make sense economically anyway to have a dairy industry. It simply does not add up economically. If you take away the subsidies, if you think about the investment that's given to that industry in terms of the common agricultural policy from the EU or direct investments from our own government to support that industry, without that, it simply would not be able to maintain itself because it doesn't make sense. Obviously, cows are very large animals and they require a lot of space, they require a lot of food, a lot of water in order to grow and get to the size that they are as adults so that they can start to produce. It requires a huge number of inputs for an output that is actually of no great economic value. So the industry itself doesn't make any sense. And that is true of all animal farming enterprises. Without the subsidy, those industries would collapse overnight because they literally do not make economic sense. But we're afraid to acknowledge that. We're afraid for some strange reason to acknowledge that we are supporting and endorsing and giving our money to something that is literally draining money away. And it is not only draining money away, it's draining away and damaging the very environment upon which we depend for our survival. As we know, so much of rainforest regions, for example, is cut down to make way to grow soya so that we can then give that as cattle feed or cow feed to animals so that they can grow into either dairy cows or to beef cows. But that environment is something we absolutely depend upon. We need those Amazon rainforests and rainforest regions around the world. We need them to stay as they are, as the very lungs of our planet. And yet that's a resource that's being taken away and literally eaten up purely and simply for an industry that is absolutely non-sustainable.
It is astonishing, isn't it? I'll just give you, there's some estimates around the economics. There's like 7 kilos of grain to make 1 kilo of beef, for instance, which is just ridiculous when you consider the resources that are piled in to make meat products and animal products.
Yes, absolutely, and you're right that it is really that bad. If we had any other kind of industry where the input to output ratio was as bad as what it is for animal farming, there is no way that it would be supported at all. We would just say, well, that obviously makes no sense. And you're right about, the 8 pounds of grain for 1 pound of beef, for example. I mean, the ratios go from, depending on the animal species concerned, a ratio of like 1 to 8 or up to 1 to 20. It requires a huge amount of investment of land and water and energy, all for something that is, is fractional compared to those inputs. The outputs are trivial. And yet, as we know, and as anybody knows, I mean, it's a basic it's like Nutrition 101. It is such a basic that we know that, obviously, plants have protein too. And we can get all of the nutrients that we need from plant-based foods instead, where there is nothing like the investment required in terms of the amount of land or the amount of water that's required or the amount of energy that's needed to produce plant-based foods compared to animal farming. It just does not make any sense. And we could, and it's absolutely within our grasp, of course, to just do things so much more differently. And that would be better for everyone.
Now, the Wildlife Fund, one of the charity people came to my door just recently, and she said to me, what did I feel about Cecil the lion? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I'm obsessed about Cecil, but actually I'm more concerned about the billions of land animals that are killed on our farms every year. Now, you give some amazing statistics, and you talk about 60 billion land animals and the sea-dwelling animals, of which you have a rough estimate, which is 100 million tonnes.
Yeah,
it's just astonishing. And then we've had, half the world's wildlife has basically disappeared in the last 40 years.
Yes, indeed so, and we're continuing with that destruction at an ever-increasing rate. And you're right that I mentioned the 60 billion land animals, destroyed and killed in the animal farming industry every year. Likelihood is that is going to increase next year, and the likelihood is that is going to increase the year after. And on current projections, by 2050, we're looking at something like 120 billion land animals per year would have to be killed in order to provide the amount of meat that's expected to be consumed. And that is fundamentally unsustainable. There simply is not the availability of land and water resources in order to be able to provide for that. And of course behind that anyway, 120 billion is an enormous number, 60 billion is an enormous number. But behind that, of course, are all those individuals who suffer and die one at a time behind that. And then they just add up to this huge number that is so difficult for us to contemplate, but with the expectation, unless we do start to address these issues, that number is going to increase. And you mentioned too about the sea-based, the sea lives that we destroy every year, 100 million tons, which as an approximation, because the number is literally uncountable, is an approximation of around about 1.5 to 2 trillion individual sea animals killed by us every single year. Again, with the expectation that number is going to continue to increase. But how on earth, literally, do we think that the planet is going to be able to sustain that kind of resource depletion? We're all very familiar, I'm sure, with the number of fisheries, so-called, around the world that are fundamentally depleted and absolutely damaged permanently, where we had previously many millions of animals living every year, and now they are literally water deserts. There's nothing living there anymore because our fishing vessels get bigger every year, they go deeper, they trawl harder, they're more aggressive in what they're dragging up from the seas and the oceans, and it takes everything, it takes everyone from those environments and leaves no one and nothing behind. And yet we rely absolutely on those marine environments in order to sustain a biological system that is going to work for everybody who lives on Earth. When we damage those marine environments, that has a massive effect, as we know, on the global ecosystem, on the environment and on the climate. That then impacts itself upon the land environment, which we're also damaging at an unsustainable rate because of the demands of animal farming. And you add all that up together, and what we get is what we see right now, which is a climate that is getting out of control. And we know that governments are getting together and talking about what they're going to do, and they talk about carbon emissions, and they talk about transportation policies broadly, and they talk about emissions from most heavy industries, but what they neglect to mention, what doesn't get spoken about hardly at all, is the impact of animal farming on all of that, and the very significant impact that it has. I mean, estimates are difficult to come by, but best indications suggest that it is animal farming is either number one or at least, at worst, number two in terms of its impact on global climate change and the ecological damage that is being caused around the world. We have got to stop doing things. We have got to stop what we have been doing and start to do things differently. And if you think about it, the foods that we choose to put on our plate for dinner and the things we have for breakfast, that's actually really quite easy. Certainly in first world, so-called, countries such as the UK, there's such an abundance of alternatives to the animal farming products that we can have. If we do that, if we simply change the way we eat, we can make a massive, immediate difference to our impact on the environment.
I believe that people would really struggle with understanding that farm animals are actually meant to be free, because I think most people have seen them only in that environment. They've only ever seen them in an enslavement environment. So actually seeing them as free, I think, is a really big step for some people to consider. Yes,
I think you're right. And again, I do go into that in quite some detail in the Meat Delusion, because it is something that we grow up with from a very early age. If you think about, the stories and the books that we show to our children when they're, very young, if we have any animals in there, so-called farmed animals in there, it is, as you say, it's exclusively within the environment of them being farmed, not as being free living animals. And when we talk about animal farming, it is what we show to these young children. It is the classic 18th century image of what a nice little family farm would be like, where the animals look really happy and they're roaming around and it's all fun and everybody looks all jolly and clean and it's all very nice and everybody's talking to each other as they would do in children's books, of course, but everybody seems very happy about being farmed animals. And the one bit, of course, that's missing from any of those stories and tales that are told is the slaughterhouse doesn't come into it at all. That doesn't get mentioned. We don't expose our children to that kind of thing, possibly because we kind of feel guilty about that ourselves and we don't really want people to know about that. So even from a very early age, children are seeing certain species with whom we share this world as being exclusively farmed animals not as individuals in their own right who want to live their own lives according to their own ways of their own species, but purely and simply as something that is supposed to only exist on the farm, with all that that entails for them, which, as I say, is always going to be uniformly fatal for them, even when they're still very young and they could potentially have many, many more years of life in them. So it's something that people grow up with, it's something that people start with, and then as we go through and we get older, we just see the same things repeated again and again. You think about programs on television that people are exposed to, programs, for example, like the BBC's Country File program on a Sunday evening. It just presents, again, the same idealized, idyllic image of animals on the farm. It's all a fun, jolly thing, and the farmers are all very, very nice, and they all really, really care about their animals and things, and it's all so good. And nobody is perceiving or seeing that there is nothing natural about a pig living on a farm, or existing, as they actually do, on a farm. There is nothing natural about hens being forced to produce one or more eggs every single day until their bodies are exhausted and depleted and they're sent off for slaughter. There's nothing inevitable about cows existing only as a so-called resource to produce milk for us. And, you know, thinking about the dairy thing, it strikes me as odd in the extreme, but doesn't, because of what people grow up with, as extreme at all, that humans are actually drinking the breast milk of another species. It is just the strangest thing. No other species on Earth continues to consume breast milk after weaning. They go on to solids and they grow up. It is only human beings that continue to have milk in their diet, even when they are supposed to have gone off that and gone off weaning and moved on to other foods. And we choose not only to continue to have milk, but the milk of other animals instead of our own mother's milk. It's all just so strange, and yet it is presented as being something so completely natural and normal. And yet there is nothing natural and normal about the consumption of milk products at all. And so you're right that people have these views, they're presented with these things, they're bombarded with it day after day, whether it's on the television or in the press, or it's the billboards they see, or the things that are made available to them in restaurants and so-called fast food joints. It's always the same stuff again and again and again. Our society is still dominated by foods that are animal body based, and it is a challenge to get people to understand that, but I am doing my best to help people to understand that they've been sold a lie, and there's people who are making a lot of money out of that lie, and they enjoy that lie, and it's working for them, you know, and if it continues in that way, they're absolutely fine about it. Whatever the implications for the people consuming those products in terms of their physical health, in terms of the damage done to the environment, those industries behind animal farming are fine about all of that. They don't mind, because there's money in it for them. And it comes down, as you said a while ago, to the economics of it. At the moment, despite it being unsustainable, they're subsidized, everything's okay, they're making money, and so they will continue to peddle a big, big lie to people. And people are bombarded with that every which way they turn. So it is difficult, I absolutely get it. It's difficult for people to be able to see beyond all of that and to come to terms with the fact that throughout probably their whole lives, they have been told by everybody, every which way, something that is fundamentally untrue. They've been told again and again that they must have meat products. They've been told again and again, you must have dairy products in your diet, especially for your bones, they're told again and again. If you want big, strong, healthy bones, then you must consume milk. Even though we know, and the evidence is abundantly, absolutely clear, that the consumption of milk is damaging the bones of people who consume those products, that it is the wrong product in our bodies. Because it's very, very acidic, the cow's milk that we're drinking, or the goat's milk that we consume. It goes into our system, and our body, which is an alkaline system, has to react to that. And the only way it can react to having something so acidic inside it, this calcium going into it that's so acidic, it leaches the calcium from the body itself, which is in our bones, and so it weakens our bones. The evidence is abundantly clear. Those countries which have the highest proportion of milk consumption also have the highest incidence of things like osteoporosis for people in later life. those who consume a lot of milk and dairy products are damaging their bones. But it's crazy. The milk industry literally and explicitly tells us exactly the opposite, and they get away with it. They're allowed to do this. Nobody's standing up and telling the truth about these things, and it's hard to get that across. But whatever we can do, whatever I can do, whether it's through my books or my public speaking, my advocacy in schools, continue to just show people that there is abundant scientific evidence about things like this, that they don't have to have meat, they don't have to have the dairy, talk about the realities of the lives for animals on the farms and what that means to them, talk about the damage done to the environment, whether that's the land environment or the marine environment on our planet, purely and simply because of animal farming. Once you start to present that information, as I do to people, then I find more often than not people are genuinely interested in that. They do want to hear about what these things are. Nobody likes being lied to, and people are very interested in finding out what the realities might mean. And with things like social media these days and the internet, it is a lot easier than it was in the past to go and find extra information out. I always say to people when I give my talks and things, it's like, don't just listen to me, go and find out for yourself. I want people to think for themselves about these issues and find out for themselves. You know, read my books, listen to what I'm saying, but don't stop there. Go and find out for yourself. Go and learn about what's really happening. And when they do that, they will find some information that's now there that just tells them that it's completely opposite of what they've been told for so many, many years.
Now, let me just pick up on the implications on health, because you've made a very good point about the dairy industry and the link with osteoporosis. If you look at hip fractures in the UK, it's huge, and then 1 in 5 die after hip fractures. It's an astonishing number of people who actually have bone issues and then go on to have ill health after it. But let me just come in there with psychological damage, because I have a belief that if you are eating the flesh of an animal that actually has led an inherently unhappy life and has been killed full of fear, you're actually absorbing something which had a significant amount of adrenaline, cortisol, and clearly for me that energetically isn't good for the soul. Never mind the ill health physically it's going to create to you, which is obviously well documented now. What's your feelings around that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is the physical implication of consuming foods that are not meant for us and consuming things that have a massive detrimental impact on our physical health. But you're right about the mental thing too, the psychological state that we put ourselves in. Because you're right that when people are doing this, whilst they try not to think about it too much, they do at the back of their minds, they do have this notion that they're doing something that is about suffering, it's about pain, it's about death, and it's likely, therefore, to be something that's violent, and they're consuming things that are violent. And if you talk to people about these things, people do become very reactive, and they can often become quite upset. If you talk about what things go on in slaughterhouses, even if these people are those who choose to consume the products of the slaughterhouse, when you start talking about the reality of what goes on in those places, then people become very, very upset. They become very emotionally strained because of what they haven't been confronted with, the kinds of things that they're thinking about, and that's already there in them. You're not giving them anything that they don't really already know. They've already got this notion that there must be something pretty bad behind it, which is why we put our slaughterhouses, of course, way out of town and way out of view from anybody, so we don't want people to know too much about what goes on. But people have got this inkling that there's something bad, and when you start to give more information about that, you can see how visibly upset people become because of what they're being confronted with. And when you talk about, you know, the emotional lives of farmed animals and how intelligent, for example, pigs are, and the bond between, you know, a mother cow and her calf, and you talk about the social lives of chickens, which they would ordinarily be able to express but can never express naturally in the environments in which they're confined. When you start to give people all of this evidence about these animals and how they potentially could live their lives, and the fact that they cannot do that because of what happens to them, because people want to consume their body parts, again you see there is this psychological impact, and people are being confronted by something that has a big effect on them. And yes, it's an important point that people have got to have that willingness and that steeliness, if you like, to an extent, to be able to sit back, allow themselves to absorb the information, allow themselves to find out about what's going on and learn a bit more about what's actually happening because of those industries. And then for them to start thinking themselves, do they really want to be a part of that? Because people ultimately don't want to be bad people, and they don't want to perceive themselves to be bad people. And nobody's trying to say that they are bad people, but they've been lied to and they've been, hoodwinked about things that made them participate in systems of fundamental violence and cruelty and suffering and pain. And if you give people an opportunity to learn and know about those things, then I think more often than not people will start to think about their participation in it once they've got that new knowledge about what's really going on. And they want to step away from that, and that can only ever be emotionally a positive thing for them and psychologically a positive thing for them. And you make that very good point as well about what people are consuming. We are literally, of course, what we eat, and we're only sustained because we do eat foods. That's the only thing, of course, that is ultimately going to keep us alive. And so if you're eating foods that look good and smell good naturally, the fruits and the vegetables that we have available to us with all the colour that they offer and all the fragrances and how good that feels when you eat it and the vitality and the sense of, energy that gives you, then that is so, so much better, not only physically but also psychologically. When you eat a good, healthy meal, your mind feels better as well as your body, rather than eating, the fast foods, the heavily processed meats that people have got. And that just makes people feel overfull and stuffed and slovenly, and it doesn't give them that sense of vitality and energy. You're right, it's a dead thing. You're putting death inside of you. That is almost inevitably going to make you feel low and unenergetic, because it's just the opposite of what life is supposed to be about. Eating food, of course, is supposed to be something that makes us feel good, makes us feel happy and comfortable with what we're doing and how we're doing it, and giving us that positive sense of energy, which is a psychological thing. It's an emotional thing as much as it's a physical thing.
Now let's just pick up on the emotions there of the actual animals themselves, because I've got a dog. I've had dogs for a long, long time. I know that my whippet can clearly emotionally tell me how he's feeling in so many different ways. He has so many expressions on his face. It makes me laugh at times. But I believe, and he's very good at getting treats, I have to say, I believe the industry, though, have done a great job of pretending that animals don't have emotions, yet there's lots of research. Just look at Safina's work, who basically talks about, it was clear to him that animals feel and they suffer, they experience perception, thought, emotion. Animals know who they are, don't they?
They absolutely do. They are absolutely individuals in exactly the same way that you and I are individuals. They have their own personalities, they have their own minds, they have their own likes and dislikes. All of the evidence that we have, if we pay close attention to them and if we allow them the opportunity to express their sense of self and their emotions, then we see just how complex their minds are and how profoundly rich their lives can be when they have that opportunity to express their natural behaviors. As I say, I've mentioned pigs already and about how intelligent they are. They are such incredibly inquisitive animals. They learn and know so much. What people have said is that they have the intelligence of a 3 or 4 year old human child. These are really smart animals. And yet you think of how degraded and debased they are in the farming environment, where none of their natural behaviors can be expressed, where they are confined in the most monotonously dull, miserable environment. The sheer profound psychological damage that does to them is absolutely appalling. But it's not only pigs. Chickens, like all birds, are super smart animals. And I have a number of rescue hens myself in my back garden. I'm looking at them right now. It's time for them to go to bed in a few minutes. But they all express, completely individual personalities. They look at you in their own individual way, and they have their own little likes and dislikes, places they like to go, ways that they like to express themselves, favourite parts of the environment that they've got to roam around in. and the favourite foods and the way they like different things and, the different friendships that they form between each other. You can see just how incredibly individual they are. Just as, for example, like sheep as well. Sheep are often bundled together as just dull, dumb-witted animals, just like herd, like just follow the crowd type thing. Talking about people as sheep is often, done in quite a negative context, but all sheep are very individual animals, but they're obviously very smart too, and they know that strength is in numbers for them. Obviously, where they've had previously, through the evolutionary history, a number of natural predators, then herding and bonding together has been very, very smart survival way of being for them. So they do that. It's a perfectly reasonable thing, but they're also individuals too. And you think about what's called lambing season in the farming industry, you see the incredible sense of life and energy and vitality and sense of fun and joy that all of these lambs express when they're just finding their way in the world around them and everything that's interesting, and they're so inquisitive and they're so fascinated by everything around them, and they just want to know about everything and get involved in everything and just do so many things. Just like you say, just like a dog would, like a puppy would, they're just so fabulously inquisitive about the world around them. Just like little kitten cats would do, they're fascinated by things and they want to explore. Lambs are exactly the same. And yet, just because they're lambs and not cats or dogs, then their lives end literally weeks later in the most appalling, brutal and violent fashion. We just destroy them, and there's so much life there, so much potential, so much going on in their minds, and they do have minds, and they obviously have personalities. It's absolutely abundantly clear. And anyone who takes the time just to look into the eyes of any farmed animal, whether that's a cow or a sheep or a pig or a chicken or a turkey or whoever, if you look into their eyes, you know absolutely that you're looking at someone, and they are genuinely a someone. They are an individual being with their own life, their own personality, their own desires, their own likes and dislikes and all those other things that we have. We share those kinds of feelings with them. We don't have them and they don't. It's something that we share together. And just looking into their eyes, let alone all of the, the formal scientific literature that describes the complexity of their minds and all the research that's been done to talk about their personalities and all these kinds of things. It's obvious anyway if you just look at them and let them look back at you. You know you're being looked at by someone.
My final question, Richard, is how can we expect people to have respect for animals when we only see ourselves as productive life? Our governments only see us in terms of economic productive life. We're barbaric enough to rape, maim and kill each other. We go to war regularly. Aren't our animals just caught up in what we're doing to ourselves, which is ultimately killing what is a very beautiful and rare planet?
Yes, you're absolutely right, and it is something that is inordinately challenging to confront when you think of it in exactly those terms. And that is why at the beginning I did describe this as a social justice issue, because I do see it is part of a bigger, wider struggle, which is a struggle for liberation for all persons, whether they're human or non-human. There is still, despite the many advances that I talked about a while ago, despite a lot of the progress we have made, there is still too much exploitation of one group by another. There is still a dramatically, appallingly unequal political system that we have either in this country and other countries, where there is oppression and repression of certain groups. And you're right that economics for the elite, a self-appointed elite, is taking precedence over every other concern, including the imminent ecological catastrophe that's going to befall us unless we start doing something positive with the environment that we depend upon. It is a major challenge to overcome that, and you're right that farmed animals, being in the position that they are, as weak as they are, because we do have the power to control them, they are caught up in that system of exploitation and abuse, and they have a lesser voice perhaps than any other group on the planet. So it is a challenge, but we have to see liberation as being a genuine single struggle against systems that are not inevitable, The way that society is constructed today is not an inevitability. It doesn't have to be this way. And for my advocacy and what I'm trying to do, I focus on the rights of other animals that I share this world with. It's not to the exclusion of human rights at all. I do a lot of human rights advocacy as well. But I do have a focus on the non-human animals in this world, because I do believe that they are the most abused group on the planet because of what happens to them. But also I think that if we start to give ourselves the opportunity to see them for who they are, and we start to recognize the value that they have with their own lives and start to see them as being individuals who have the right to live their own lives, then it makes it so much more difficult to then start to try and impose restrictions or oppressions and repressions on others of our own kind. If we see that pigs and cows and sheep and rats and dogs and cats and who knows are all valuable equally on this earth as fellow earthlings that we share this planet with, then we see other humans as being part of that same intricate web of life as well. So I would like to hope that people will see that the struggle, the fight for the rights of non-human animals is part of this wider struggle for liberation for all in our society, and that we will have the determination, the courage to stand up and speak up where we see injustice, wherever it is, and whoever it's against, that we will stand up and say, no, this is wrong, and together we will do something about it, and we will change how we structure our society. Everything we have today is only the way it is because certain people have decided it's that way. There is nothing inevitable about how we live our lives today. We can change, and tomorrow can be an awful, awful lot better for everyone.
Richard Deeboo, thank you so much for coming on Food for Thought. I very much appreciate it. It's been really interesting to talk to you today. Now, tell everybody how they get in contact with you to get you to speak, and how do they find your book?
Yeah, they can find out lots more about me on my website, which is www.richarddeboo.com, and that's RICHARDDEBOO. So there's lots of information on there about how people can get in touch with me. I'm also on other social media forums as well, such as Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram and all the other little bits and pieces we have these days. So there's lots of ways for people to get in touch with me there. And my books are available online. You can go to Amazon and type in my name or the titles of my books, The Meat Delusion or Who Speaks for Earthlings, and it'll crop up there, or any of the other online bookseller retailers as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you very much.